The Last Kingdom by Bernard Cornwell is an epic um, historical fiction in the 8th century AD about the Danish invasions of England, and it follows an orphaned English noble who's assimilated into the Danish or Viking culture and armies. And it's known and should be known for being one of the most realistic uh, medieval combat insights, like insights into what medieval combat actually is like. It's just so well written. Um, it's like a observer says on the cover here, like Game of Thrones, but real. That's very accurate. So sometimes people like me, fans of action, pulp heavy stuff, who appreciate some good hand to hand immersive fighting, that don't really enjoy violence, but I enjoy the challenge of having to see it and confront the reality of it as a big part of what has shaped our Western civilization throughout history. The ideals that have come through, that have survived through the rise and fall of past civilizations. It's to me, I've always seen violence, especially government sponsored violence, in other words, warfare, and the origins of warfare and how it's come to evolve to be modern warfare. I feel like it's something that as a man I always need to confront. And so I sort of enjoy the challenge of confronting it by knowing about it, because I myself have a hard time imagining that there'd ever be any reason I'd have to actually get involved in it. And so people like me who have similar inclinations for whatever reason, maybe it's in our male DNA or something. I don't. Not to say females don't like a good pulp action heavy thing once in a while as well, to some extent, but people like me in that regard often are confused into romanticizing the Dark Ages and thinking that it's more akin to some sort of fantasy, fairy tale with chivalry and honor, and everything was more noble back then, like something from video games. I don't know. But the reality really bites. The truth hurts. The truth cuts like a sword. Um, Basically, this book is a very humilifying experience. It's a very somber, rough. Um, it makes you respect all of the millions of people that lived through those ages, and realizing the reality of it will retroactively make you grateful for true Christian philosophies that helped shape the West, that and the idea of human rights, which didn't exist back then. It was just might is right mentality backed by much more primitive theological outlooks, and that steered a lot of the motives for a lot of the operations of all these armies and soldiers and how they did business and work together. It also demystifies the association of like knights being or soldiers being independently minded. A lot of them, the spirit of like the mercantile, is that the proper term, or mercenary lifestyle, really is what drove them. In other words, a lot of it's about gain, money, and it's very non-virtuous. It's not enlightening. It's not intellectual. But yet, nonetheless, despite all that, there's something to be deeply respected about the strength, the bravery, and of course, one wouldn't want to go too far with that and romanticize those themes and thought patterns and plug it into the modern equivalents of whatever role in society you have, especially if you're some sort of government-backed, I don't know, like a PMC or in special forces or in law enforcement. So it's because it's a slippery slope into justifying basically being a barbarian, especially as we see the modern social fabric of previous conventions degrade, which risks keeping the peace. It risks how we collectively, the citizenry of America now defines law and order, as everything's being redefined because of the false ideologies, the mind viruses going around. But in any case, this was a very immersive, humbling, deeply affecting insight into a world that might as well feel like another planet because it's so alien. So much has been lost to history. There could be intense exaggerations that are so well written and detailed in here. I'd be none the wiser because I'm such a novice with that time period. From what little I do know, though, it does seem to align with everything feeling feasible enough. Like there's nothing in here I couldn't imagine people having not done at some point in history, but it's nonetheless shocking and almost removing you from the experience, just the sheer frequency of brutal things that happened, because it's almost as if how a modern average Westerner, modern man sees or woman sees sadism now is something as being distinctly outside of our collective shared sort of concept of civilization. Back then, it was integrated into something that people were so immersed with regularly, it had a different definition. It might just be seen as the consequence. Sadism being, at the mercy of sadistic evils, especially in a group setting, reminds me of the Salem witch trials, is the consequence of essentially not playing the same Game of Thrones that everyone else is playing. Basically, Midas right mentality is what all people are all indoctrinated, and the events in this story retroactively prove that that's innate in human nature, which I particularly think is evil. I think true Christian theology and dogma, for example, is actually technically not oppressive in the grander scheme of human history and people's compared against other theological, views towards reality and morality and those larger concepts. It's actually the opposite of oppressive. It's actually the exception to the norm. And so that just goes to show, by contrast, how spoiled I've been coming from a nation that's so much at peace. So insightful is kind of an understatement, to make a long story short. I don't want to give anything away, but overall, it's just a very powerful read that is very insightful as much as it is engaging and interesting and action heavy. But it's also disturbing. For most people, it probably would be disturbing, appropriately so. And so you've been warned. I give it 10 out of 10 for being true to everything its genre and everything it promises, and really putting you there immersively. Like the immersive quality is just totally nailed. It's totally nailed. So the only real complaint I have, the only thing that sort of take me out of the experience, is the frequency by which Uhtred narrowly avoids death one too many times, and the frequency of seemingly unlikely events that transpire that seem a little bit too convenient for the typical saga-oriented romantic epic historical fiction, but as it goes from scene to scene, there's not a single scene that doesn't feel, possible, and it all just works. I don't really like the first person narrative. I never really have. It's okay in this. It doesn't immerse me as much as the third person. As one who judges quality in fiction through how much I get immersed, because as I've said in many other videos, I have a hard time getting immersed. The older I get and the more shit I see in the world. But this one is a good sort of cathartic, almost, like in the way the same reason I like Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. It's almost a juxtaposition of similar negative content we all tend to experience the longer we live our mortal life, so to say. That generates a sort of juxtapose, like understanding by processing negative things and realizing that the human race is evolving, and many things we might complain about now if we choose to focus on negative things, but by comparison to conditions of the past, there are so many improvements that we take for granted. So I found myself being inadvertently inspired with a new level of gratitude for so much of the what is now common knowledge, having come out of the darkened ages where ignorance and might is right mentality and the sadistic capacity for human nature was ingrained in processes of government and control and conquest and colonialism eventually, and all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of, for me, it's kind of a mind bomb. It was really good, and I definitely will read the sequel. I think in these, what's known as the Saxon stories, there's, I don't know, 6 or 7 books in that series, but this guy has written a lot of historical fiction from all different, time periods, and I'm definitely a huge fan. I'm coming late to this. I think this was written in 2004, about 21 years ago. Yeah, so just a treasure trove, just discovering a whole treasure box full of worlds to get lost in. Like it is as good as a like grimdark escapist fantasy fiction, but it's better in some ways. It's not as good in other ways, and it's altogether, I would say, in one word, very powerful experience. Thank you.